Tonight on All In.
If the president was your client, would you put him on the stand?
I think it's a particularly bad idea for Trump because he lacks all self-control.
The former president descends the golden air stairs, landing in New York for his surrender to justice as new evidence in the document case keeps on coming.
I can't imagine you ever saying, bring me some of the boxes that we brought back from the White House. I'd like to look at them. Did you ever do that?
I would have the right to do that. There's nothing wrong with it.
Tonight, Congressman Adam Schiff on the eve of Trump's first court appearance, plus the timeline for finding out what's actually in the charges, why the publicity-seeking ex-president is arguing against cameras in court, and why Jack Smith's subpoenas for the Secret Service could be the clearest sign yet that more charges are coming. And All In starts right now. Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Right now, Donald Trump is back in New York City, just a few blocks from here. In fact, he is spending the night at Trump Tower ahead of his arraignment on criminal charges tomorrow afternoon. This afternoon, in a surreal spectacle, vaguely reminiscent of the infamous O.J. Simpson Bronco chase, we got helicopter footage of the indicted ex-president's motorcade traveling from Mar-a-Lago to the Florida airport, where he boarded his Trump-branded plane and flew to New York City's LaGuardia Airport, landing a little after 3 p.m. local time. Then we got more motorcade footage. We also learned that he brought some of his top campaign staff with him, which does seem a little odd for an arraignment, but hey. Unless, of course, he's trying to write off this trip as a campaign expense, which, you never know. Tomorrow, Trump is expected to head to downtown Manhattan, where he will surrender to authorities at a New York courthouse who will inform him he's under arrest. He will be fingerprinted. We still don't know if there will be a mugshot. We've got some sort of conflicting information on that score. The ex-president will then be arraigned. The indictment against him, including what we believe to be about 30 counts of document fraud, will be unsealed. To be clear, we have no idea what exactly those charges are. No one does, really, even all the people speculating about them being bad charges or paper thin. We likely won't know until tomorrow. Once the indictment is made public, it's still unclear how much it will actually reveal, because it could be a lengthy document painting a detailed picture of the crimes the ex-president is accused of, or could just be a bare-bones list of charges with little additional context. However, by this time tomorrow, we should have a much clearer idea of what Donald Trump is in for. As for the arraignment itself, right now it's unclear if we will actually see it. Cameras will be present to try to catch Trump entering the courthouse. There's been a request for cameras to be allowed in the courtroom itself. Now, this is really interesting. Listen to this. Trump's lawyers argued against that request today to have cameras in the courtroom by writing in part, quote, "We submit," ready for this, "that the media request should be denied because it will create a circus-like atmosphere at the arraignment." Now, if Donald Trump was really concerned about a circus-like atmosphere, it's about 7 years too late for that, isn't it? And it's not like the ex-president is exactly camera shy. You saw him there waving to the onlookers as he went into Trump Tower. In fact, once he arrives back in Florida tomorrow night, he's planning a live televised address from Mar-a-Lago. Right now, the New York Police Department is stressing there are no credible threats of violence facing the city. We do know there will be pro-Trump crowds protesting on the ex-president's behalf, including a planned rally near the courthouse tomorrow morning featuring Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia, the MAGA ringleader, influential member of the House Republican caucus. Today, New York City Mayor Eric Adams invoked Greene by name when he urged protesters to remain peaceful.
While there may be some rabble-rousers thinking about coming to our city tomorrow, our message is clear and simple. Control yourselves. New York City is our home, not a playground for your misplaced anger. People like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is known to spread misinformation and hate speech. She stated she's coming to town. While you're in town, be on your best behavior.
Of course, it's not exactly clear if Trump wants his supporters to be on their best behavior. That has not been the signal he's been sending them. He spent the past few weeks doing everything he can to rile them up on social media, urging them to protest on his behalf. At one point, he called for his supporters to, quote, take back our nation. And if that language sounds familiar, it's almost exactly, the rhetoric that he used in the lead up to January 6th. Trump's campaign says it has raised $7 million since news broke about his indictment. But while that may be a boon for his presidential campaign, it's certainly helping with fundraising. On some level, I think Trump understands, and the people around him understand, that it's not a good thing. It's never a good thing when you have to surrender yourself to the authorities. As one Trump ally told NBC News last month, quote, "This is a guy that for decades has spent his life trying to not be indicted. He thinks it's a really bad look." To add to that, here's what Trump's former lawyer and the key witness in the Manhattan case, Michael Cohen, told Ari Melber tonight.
This is not something that Donald is capable of either understanding or contending with. He believes he could control every situation. This is not a situation that he has any control over, and that's making him sick to his stomach.
And you think he'll feel genuine fear?
Yes. I think right now he's beyond petrified.
I'm joined now by Jonathan Dienst, chief investigative reporter for WNBC, chief justice contributor for NBC News, and a cherished colleague. Great to have you here. We're waiting on two rulings from this judge, right? There are two motions right now. Take me through them. There's one on the cameras, and there's one about a question about whether this indictment will be unsealed. What do we know about these?
Our best information is the indictment will not be unsealed until Donald Trump appears in court tomorrow. And once that happens, the judge literally takes the paper out from the envelope and it becomes public. And then we will learn what's contained in those charges. We are still waiting to hear from the judge if he will allow cameras in the court. All the press has asked for access, both a still camera and a video camera, to film this proceeding. It is unclear if the judge is going to allow cameras in for the full proceeding or just an initial proceeding. In the past, he's let cameras in to film like the first minute or two, then he has the cameras leave, and then the hearing proceeds. Or he could say no cameras at all. The Trump team filed a motion today, as you pointed out.
Which was interesting.
They said it'll add to a circus. They say it'll be unfair to him because the image of him as a defendant, will ruin the appearance of innocence, among other complaints. So we'll see what the judge rules. We're waiting. Will that decision come tonight? Will it come tomorrow? We stand by. The last point, if there are no cameras in that courtroom, we're hearing there will be no electronic devices allowed in during the hearing. That means we will not be getting real-time texts or emails, updates as to what's happening in court. So remember what happened with Martha Stewart, where as suddenly the court hearing ends and everyone runs out and rushes and tries to accurately report what happened. We may see some version of that. We are also waiting when the judge unseals. We're also at the mercy of the district attorney's office when they decide to email out the actual document, because inside court, they're not going to read the entire document. Right. They're going to just name a few of the charges, and then how do you plead, Mr. Trump? And he'll say not guilty, and it'll be a short hearing. In terms of the precedent here, generally there's not cameras in these arraignments. I mean, just as the days going by. Periodic. Sometimes they allow stills in. Right. Sometimes they allow in for that short version. Yeah. The administrative rules allow for it. Yes. Albany has not made it easy for the cameras and the press here in New York. They have not. And we continue to try. Yeah, but there's a possibility the cameras will be there. And it's interesting. I mean, just that being contested by the Trump folks, obviously they understand the optics of that. What they want is they want people to see him getting off the plane branded his name, and not that sort of iconic, how do you plead, Your Honor sort of thing. Right. And also interesting, the DA's office was asked, and they filed a paper basically saying, we're not taking a position. Right. Now, the press wants in, right. Trump, the lawyers say no, and we'll see what the judge decides. We also have word, I think, that the DA himself, Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan DA, will be giving some remarks, we think, at some point. So we will get some kind of explanation more than the document itself, even if that document is a fairly sparse listing of the charges. Right. We expect there'll be a little bit more than a sparse listing. There'll be some explaining in the document. And DA Bragg is expected to hold a news conference at 3:30 tomorrow to announce the charges and take some questions, but don't expect him to go too far outside what's in the indictment. He's a former federal prosecutor. He's very conservative. We've done numerous press conferences with him where no matter how hard we try, he doesn't really break from where he intended to go. But it will be a very interesting 3:30 news conference, to say the least. Just finally, quickly, do we know what the scene down there is in terms of the cordon that the Secret Service is putting, whether people are going to be around, or is it going to be a fairly sort of sanitized area where no one can enter? The place where we believe Mr. Trump is going in is 1 Hogan Place, which is the entrance to the district attorney's office. It's a very small street. We're told that will be shut down. Right. We've heard conflicting reports. Will there be a tent like you've seen sometimes with presidential or dignitaries? The car gets driven in, or will there just be sheets up? So maybe our choppers will see. So we're still waiting for some details. Or will the street just be frozen? And from a distance, will we get a shot similar to what NBC obtained tonight of Mr. Trump going into Trump Tower? So that's that. And then around the building immediately, we hear the protesters are going to be kept back somewhat of a distance. They're still working out the press pen zone. There's a crush of media already down there, and it's only going to grow. They've been lined up for hours just trying to get tickets. There's 60 seats or so for the courtroom itself and about 200 seats for the overflow rooms as the whole world is watching to see what happens tomorrow.
Yeah, it's a little late to prevent the circus situation. Jonathan Dienst, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Congressman Adam Schiff is a Democrat of California, led the first impeachment of Donald Trump, served on the January 6th committee, currently a candidate for Senate in 2024, and he joins me now. Congressman is someone who has sought after, pursued some form of legal accountability for the president. Your reaction to us being at a moment where this is actually happening?
Well, it's a historic and unprecedented day. Sad to see the office of the presidency brought so low. But it is accountability catching up with Donald Trump. And I think it's an affirmation of the principle that no one is above the law, not the president of the United States, not anyone who's rich and powerful, that ultimately you follow the evidence to where it leads. If there's probable cause to believe a crime has been committed and the grand jury in Manhattan found there was, and the prosecutor believes they can prove beyond reasonable doubt, then they face justice. Donald Trump will face justice. And I think that is as it should be.
I want to read to you an op-ed that got quite a bit of attention this weekend by a former prosecutor making the argument that this all sets a bad precedent was the thrust of the contention. I want to read this paragraph and get your response as someone who served as a prosecutor yourself prior to joining Congress. Every local prosecutor in the country will now feel that he or she has free rein to criminally investigate and prosecute presidents after they leave office. Democrats currently cheering the charges against Trump may feel differently if or when a Democrat, perhaps even President Biden, ends up on the receiving end of a similar effort by any of the thousands of prosecutors elected to local office. What do you think of that argument?
We see variations of this over the last several years, which is if you do the right thing, that is, hold someone accountable for the right reasons, does it set a precedent that can be abused for the wrong reasons? And yes, things can always be abused for the wrong reasons. But the more dangerous precedent to set here would be to do nothing, would be to essentially say, if you're the president of the United States, you don't get held accountable. You can do what you like. You can violate the law with impunity. That's the far more dangerous precedent here. The author of that article also makes the point that he believes that Joe Biden should have weighed in and essentially got the Manhattan DA, the Fulton County DA, and the Justice Department to coordinate their efforts and the order of accountability. Can you imagine what would happen if the President of the United States involved himself in a prosecution of one of his potential opponents? I don't agree with that at all. And while I certainly do agree that the Justice Department took way too long, and it would have been much more desirable for the most serious case to go first, if indeed the Justice Department ends up moving forward with charges, that's not the responsibility or the fault of the Manhattan DA. That Manhattan DA followed the evidence to where it led. When the case was ready, it was presented to the grand jury. That's as it should be, even though I wish the Department of Justice had moved with a greater sense of urgency, and that case proceeded far before now.
There's been reporting that the ex-president has been calling congressional allies, and of course it's his allies that run the United States House of Representatives, urging them basically to do two things as far as I can read the reporting. One is to tighten the screws on Bragg by any means they can, investigate the Manhattan district attorney, subpoena him, whatever. And the other is to tighten the screws on Joe Biden, the president's family, Hunter Biden, to accelerate that stuff. What do you make of those reports?
Well, I don't know whether it's accurate that the Trump people have given those marching orders to Republicans in Congress. I'm not sure they needed to. They, during the Ukraine investigation, Jim Jordan and others, they already acted like the criminal defense lawyers for Donald Trump, and they're doing it again. Whether Jim Jordan and Kevin McCarthy needed prodding or not, I don't know. But they have already been writing to the Manhattan DA, demanding evidence, threatening essentially implicitly that they'll be subpoenaed if they don't comply. They are acting like they're going to use the power of Congress to do criminal discovery, something that, the lawyers for Trump, he already has criminal defense lawyers, probably, perfectly good ones. He doesn't need members of Congress to do that. But it is deeply concerning that Congress would try to interfere in the administration of justice. I serve on that Judiciary Committee now. Well, when I was removed from the Intel Committee, I was put in a senior position on the Judiciary Committee, and you can better believe I'm going to use my position on that committee to fight against these efforts to undermine the rule of law, because that's exactly what they're trying to do here.
All right, Congressman Adam Schiff, thank you very much. Coming up, as Donald Trump prepares to be arraigned in New York, the separate federal investigation, at least one of them, is looking stronger and stronger. We got some new details, and they explain why tomorrow might just be the beginning for Trump. That's next.
Happy 10-year anniversary to you, Chris Hayes, my most favorite person to sit next to on the big nights and my most favorite person to watch at 8 o'clock every night. Happy anniversary, friend.
As Donald Trump awaits his fingerprinting tomorrow at the Lower Manhattan courthouse, there are some really big developments in another criminal investigation into the ex-president, the federal probe into his handling of classified documents. Fox host Bret Baier reports, quote, multiple Secret Service agents connected to Trump have been subpoenaed and are expected to testify before a Washington, D.C. grand jury, likely on Friday. We can't independently confirm that. Now, that grand jury is part of the investigation run by special counsel Jack Smith. And now the Washington Post reports that, quote, federal investigators have gathered new and significant evidence that after the document's subpoena was delivered, Trump looked through the contents of some of the boxes, apparently out of a desire to keep certain things in his possession, people familiar with the investigation said. A Trump spokesman claimed the reporting is part of, quote, prosecutorial misconduct by illegally leaking information. But here's the thing. Trump basically admitted to looking through the documents last week.
I've known you for decades. I can't imagine you ever saying, bring me some of the boxes that we brought back from the White House. I'd like to look at them. Did you ever do that?
I would have the right to do that. There's nothing wrong with it.
But I know you. I don't think you would do it.
Well, I don't have a lot of time, but I would have the right to do that. Right. I would do that. There'd be
nothing. Let me move on.
Remember this. Yeah. This is the Presidential Records Act. I have the right to take stuff. Do you know that they ended up paying Richard Nixon, I think, $18 million for what he had? They did the Presidential Records Act. I have the right to take stuff. I have the right to look at stuff.
Mary McCord served as the acting assistant attorney general for national security as part of her nearly 20 years as an assistant U.S. attorney in Washington, D.C. She's also the co-host of the new podcast from MSNBC titled Prosecuting Donald Trump, and she joins me now. Let's start on that not quite admission, because he's talking hypothetically. Hannity says, well, you wouldn't have them bring you the box and go through it. He says, of course I would do that. Of course, it's mine. I have a right to that stuff. This does seem to be the nub of the issue, right? Did the ex-president personally inspect and then choose to retain information that was later found in the search?
Yeah, I mean, we used to call that kind of a question when I was a prosecutor a softball, meaning there's a really easy answer here, but Trump declined to give that really easy answer. You're right, though. What it looks like Jack Smith is focusing on is this key time period between the service of the subpoena on May 11th and then June 3rd, the date that the Department of Justice officials and the FBI visited Mar-a-Lago. They were provided with a package of 38 classified documents, including 17 with top secret markings. And they were provided with a letter signed by, we know now, by Christina Bobb, one of the president's attorneys at the time, the former president's attorneys, certifying to having conducted a diligent search and there being no additional classified records at Mar-a-Lago. So that time period now, this breaking news we've seen with the Washington Post and other reporting is, I think, focused on, did the president between that subpoena and June 3rd and perhaps even after that, but particularly in that time frame, did he look through those documents himself and maybe make some decisions about what he did not want to turn over? Because a key crime here that's being investigated is obstruction of an official proceeding that includes not only concealing and failing to provide documents to the FBI during an official proceeding, but also falsifying any record. So that letter, if he was involved in that letter, could also be key evidence of obstruction.
Yeah, I mean, so the facts as publicly reported and established are bad enough, right? That you've got a subpoena, you've got him turning over documents with a certification lawyer saying there's nothing left, then a search which finds that document was false, right? So that's established beyond a reasonable doubt, right? Like, we know that there were classified documents. So then the question becomes, was it sloppy oversight, or was there intent here? And this evidence, I mean, just to read you a few more parts, because I want to get your feedback on the legal significance of this. So they report in October that Trump's valet, Walt Nauta, has told investigators that he moved boxes at Mar-a-Lago at the former president's instruction after the subpoena was issued. Smith's team has video surveillance footage corroborating the account. They have also amassed evidence indicating Trump told others to mislead government officials in early 2022, before the subpoena, when the National Archives and Records Administration was working with the Justice Department to try to recover a wide range of papers, many of them not classified, from Trump's time as president. There seems to be a lot of evidence here of motive and knowledge and intent.
That's right. And that is key, because a mistake, can't be obstruction of justice. The concealing the false documents has to be done with intent to obstruct or influence an official proceeding. And an FBI investigation is, by law, an official proceeding. And I will tell you another thing about intent. All of that information that we're seeing and evidence that we're hearing about being accumulated, some of it goes, directly potentially to his intent during that time period, post-subpoena, pre-June 4th. But some goes even before that, including even some evidence I'm seeing in the reporting, some information that he intended to sort of, obstruct the archives, even getting things that weren't classified, because he feels, right, that he should be entitled to that. He's just wrong about that. That intent, that kind of evidence can come in a trial, not to prove action in conformity with a previous intent, but to actually prove intent. It's called other bad acts evidence. And even though that's normally excluded because a jury needs to find, in any case that the intent was there for that case, you can put in other bad acts as evidence to prove intent.
What you just referenced, which we just saw in that clip, is that he clearly has a theory of the law here, which is that it's all his. I mean, and he's not been shy about that. He says it to Hannity. Of course I would do it. It's all mine. This is essentially all made up. He and others have said I can declassify things with the power of my mind. I can telepathically turn them over. There's evidence here also amassed by the reporting of the Washington Post that he sought advice from other lawyers and advisors on how he could keep documents after being told by someone in his team he could not. People familiar with the investigation said. They have collected evidence that multiple advisors warned Trump trying to keep the documents could be legally perilous. Does it help him if he has a completely erroneous, sincerely held theory of the law that everything is his?
So, if we didn't have all this kind of information we're getting about legal advisors telling him, what the law is, and that presidential records are not yours. They are public. They are not private records. That's what the Presidential Records Act was all about after Nixon himself tried to destroy presidential tapes, right? And so this, what he's trying to do now is, I think, trying to create this facade that he actually innocently did this. But we know, or we expect, that the evidence that will be presented, if there ever is an indictment in trial, will show that he was advised time and time and time again that these were not his records.
I got to say, the reporting suggests to me an indictment is more likely than I thought it was a week ago. Mary McCord, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Still ahead, Donald Trump has evaded responsibility for nearly his entire adult life. So how worried should we be now? That's next.
Hi, I'm Tom Llamas, and for me, the news is so much more than a headline. It informs, it inspires, and it still matters. To cover it, you have to be in it. We'll take you to the front lines of the story, where it's actually happening, with NBC News journalists on the ground from all over the world. We cover what you need to know and bring your newsfeed to life. In primetime and streaming live, it's your news playlist. Join me for Top Story, weeknights at 7 Eastern on NBC News Now.
There comes a point when a singular event shapes our future, broadens our perspective, and marks a crossroad in our cultural landscape. The Turning Point, an original documentary series from MSNBC Films and executive producer Trevor Noah that explores these watershed moments for the biggest issues of our time and asks how we got here and where we go next. The Turning Point documentary series on MSNBC and streaming on Peacock.
After a lifetime of dodging accountability, the legal system does appear to finally be catching up to Donald Trump. Of course, the big question that remains as we await his arraignment is just what exactly the charges in Manhattan are, how strong those charges and other cases in the works might be, and of course, ultimately, could we see a conviction of the ex-president? Charles Coleman is a civil rights attorney who served as the prosecutor in the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office. Jeremy Saland is a criminal defense attorney who served as an assistant district attorney in the trial division of the Manhattan DA's office, and both join me now. Good to have you both here. I want to start on something I talked about with Jonathan Dienst, which is the motion by his lawyers not to let cameras in, which I just think is so fascinating. This guy who's utterly, pathologically addicted to attention, right? Completely. They come in to say, no, it's going to be a circus. You guys work as defense attorneys now. You've worked as prosecutors in the past. What do you make of that as people who've worked in those courtrooms?
I think it's a matter, Chris, of Donald Trump having always been able to control the narrative in the public space. And now he is, as you alluded to, in a space that is new, that is different, and that is out of his control. And he does not want those images. He does not want that video. He does not want those messages being communicated to the public where they see him at the mercy of someone else, at the mercy of the court, in a way that makes him look weak as a defendant. And so that's really what it's about in my eyes, not wanting to let go of the ability to control the narrative in this space.
I agree with that, but I would also say his counsel is probably petrified. They must be frightened that he will lose control, and they don't want to see that happen in the courtroom. He thrives off of that chaos, but when he is a center of that chaos, that doesn't work for him. It's manipulating others that works for him.
You know, there's also the fact that you mentioned his counsel. There's a new attorney who's been tapped, and Trump's lawyers always need to get some crazy bedrock retainer thing worked out ahead of time because he has a history of not paying his legal help or anyone. This is a guy, he's hired a top white-collar criminal defense lawyer, former federal prosecutor Todd Blanche, as his lead counsel to handle this indictment. One thing that's strange to me is everyone around Trump always talks constantly. They're tweeting, Instagram, whatever the social media is, they're on cable news. It just seems not like a great call legally at this point. What do you think?
To change counsel?
No, to be talking all the time. To run your mouth constantly.
It's never a good move. It's not a good for Michael Cohen. It's not a good move for Donald Trump. You're just creating impeachment material and a means and a mechanism to be cross-examined later with all sorts of inconsistencies.
I mean, have you ever seen anyone talk this much?
No, and I think to the point about Michael Cohen, as a former prosecutor, stepping away from Donald Trump and his counsel, every time he got in front of the camera, I just wondered,
could you imagine the heartburn in that office?
Why are you doing this? You are potentially blowing this case before we even get the grand jury a chance to vote for it. And I think that was another example of just all of the conversation, a cacophony of just mess surrounding this prosecution.
I have to say, I mean, I'm a journalist, so I'm in the bit. I love it when people talk, right? But the other part of me, just who has like some sort of like general judgment as a human being, is like, it is always an option to shut up. You could just shut your mouth. Like, you could do that, but no one can around.
Some people can, some people can't. Right? He's his own Colonel Jessup. If we were watching The Few Good Men,
right.
He doesn't have that ability, Donald Trump.
But it also, at a certain point, I mean, you got him, going after Bragg, on Truth Social. He went after the judge again. All this stuff is so outside the bounds of normal, obviously, for the hundreds of cases you guys worked, but maybe not.
Yes and no. It's obviously abnormal that you have someone that has a platform that is this large and this significant. It is not necessarily unheard of to have a defendant who has a lot to say about the judge and the prosecutor who's prosecuting. The difference is they literally don't have millions of followers across social media. Now, there have been cases, and I've tried some, where you have a situation where a defendant has made threats to you, actual physical threats, which requires a security detail for a specified amount of time. That actually happens. And I think that, people can't underestimate the severity of that and its significance. But one of the things that I'm concerned with and watching is that Donald Trump, the more he talks about this, if you see the impact take place, he is opening himself up to a gag order from this judge at some point in time.
What do you think?
In terms of the gag order, I think that's correct. Though there's a little bit of a concern here. This is a case of public interest, and this is a case where Donald Trump is using this as a mechanism to push up, as we know, from donations and campaign as he moves his presidential campaign forward. So there needs to be a balance to that. But Donald Trump, to your point, is his own worst enemy. There's some people who talk and talk. He just has the platform, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, he clearly thinks all attention's good. And I think a lot of people have come to believe that he's correct about that, partly because of 2016. I remain skeptical. I actually think things have inverted a little bit. I want to get your reaction because you worked the Manhattan DA's office under Morgenthau, who was 2 DAs ago. The DA between Bragg and Morgenthau, Cy Vance, had this to say on Meet the Press. I thought it was interesting. There was, of course, a federal case, Southern District, that was not pursued by the Manhattan DA. Here's what he had to say about that. Take a listen.
I don't want to get into the deliberations that might be covered by grand jury material, but as I believe you know, I was asked by the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District to stand down on our investigation, which had commenced involving the Trump Organization. And as someone who respects that office a great deal and believing that they may have perhaps the best laws to investigate, I did so.
It seems germane to me that the feds asked the Manhattan DA to stand down when people turn around and say, well, why now?
Well, we don't know if it's the exact same investigation. Of course. We have different prosecutors, we have a different office, and it may be an offshoot. Right. So that's a fair statement on his part, but let's find out tomorrow what this is about.
We're going to find out. Charles Coleman, Jeremy Saland, thank you both.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
Still to come with the Republican presidential frontrunner under indictment, more traditional Republicans, I guess if you want to call them that, smell an opportunity for higher office. Will it pay off to bet against Donald Trump? Ahead. This is Chris Hayes from MSNBC. The Manhattan grand jury voted to indict Donald Trump, setting a new precedent for holding American leaders accountable. But how do you convince a jury to convict a former president? On MSNBC's new podcast, Prosecuting Donald Trump, MSNBC legal contributors Andrew Weissman and Mary McCord, two of the most well-respected prosecutors in the country, break down what's next from a prosecutor's perspective. Search for Prosecuting Donald Trump wherever you're listening right now and follow.
CNBC's Last Call podcast. Get the stories behind the numbers.
There's investing news that impacts your money and your portfolio.
And the people behind the business.
And there's business news that impacts your life.
From Wall Street to K Street and Main Street. The markets may close. Your money never stops.
Last Call is really about spotting tomorrow's opportunities tonight.
Brian Sullivan hosts Last Call. Follow and listen to CNBC's Last Call on your favorite podcast platform today.
This week, we are celebrating the 10 anniversary of this show. We've been on the air here at All In for 10 whole years. That's the 10 anniversary. I learned that today. And I am truly sorry to say, we have been covering Donald Trump for 7 of those 10 years, from the day he came down that dopey escalator at Trump Tower to his arrival in Manhattan today to get arrested. So, of course, that means we were here covering this story, the ex-president's payoff to Stormy Daniels, the night the news first broke, way back in January of 2018, 1 year into Trump's presidency. And on the night that In Touch magazine published its full explosive interview with Stormy Daniels, we found, among other people, an ethics expert to react to the news. Not just any ethics expert, but the former chief ethics lawyer in the George W. Bush White House, Richard Painter, a guy who really cares about ethics. And so he really did not care for this whole sordid affair one bit. Now, you may have seen this Richard Painter interview the night it aired 5 years ago. I can tell you we have seen it in the office about 1,000 times since then. there's no contention of anything that happened here being not consensual. It was in the interview that's published a consensual encounter, which is now being denied. But if you read the interview, you can make up your own mind about whether it happened. So I guess, I mean, to the extent that you don't care about the president being unfaithful to his wife, what ethical issue is there here from your perspective?
Well, the whole thing's disgusting, but we've had a disgusting past week to 10 days. And we have a president who refers to the countries where Americans of African descent come from as S-holes. And now we have this, using hundreds of thousands of dollars to buy off silence from some porn star that he's having some kinky sex with. And now he's going to fly on down to Mar-a-Lago, get $100,000 they had on some fundraiser. And guess who's going to pay for him to fly down there in Air Force One? Us, the taxpayers. I mean, that's the big picture here.
We now have the first major polling data since news broke about the indictment of ex-President Donald Trump. Morning Consult's weekly tracker finds that among Republican primary voters, Trump is leading the field with 55%, up 3 points since the indictment news. Now, that's not particularly surprising. In fact, it's less of a bump than I would have guessed. We've seen how Republicans have rallied to Trump's side, particularly in the wake of the FBI search of the Mar-a-Lago residence. But here's the thing. With all Americans, the twice impeached, one-term, criminally indicted ex-president remains incredibly unpopular for some reason. A new poll shows that 60% of Americans approve of the decision to indict him, including majorities across all demographic breakdowns aside from party, be it gender, race, age, or education. Only 34% of Americans view Trump favorably. This is a problem for the Republican Party. The former president being indicted for potential crimes makes Republicans like him more and everyone else like him less. It's not a likely scenario, but it's possible this indictment and then I think potentially other charges in the future could end up in some kind of extinction level event for Trump and the Republican Party. If everyone, including Trump himself, were just, viewed as disgraced, right? If the bottom fell out, if there was a bank run on their political capital, if that scenario were to happen and you're a popular Republican politician who's not beholden to the MAGA faithful, like former Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson, New Hampshire Governor Chris Sununu, why wouldn't you roll the dice, get in the presidential race? Symone Sanders-Townsend served as deputy assistant to President Biden, as well as senior advisor and chief spokesperson to Vice President Harris. She's host of Symone on MSNBC and Peacock. David Drucker is a senior writer for The Dispatch, author of In Trump's Shadow, The Battle for 2024 and the Future of the GOP. And they both join me now. Symone, we got news from Asa Hutchinson, who, is not necessarily a huge name in politics, former governor, that he's going to be entering the race. Chris Sununu, who's the governor in New Hampshire and done quite well there politically. He's quite popular. And it just struck me that you might as well take a flyer, if you're those guys, on the whole thing imploding at some point in the next 18 months. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it was very notable when former Governor Asa Hutchinson made his announcement, right? The Sunday leading into the week that Donald Trump would be arraigned. And he even went so far in that interview to say that Donald Trump should drop out of the Republican primary for president. He and Chris Sununu and others have alluded to the former president as a distraction. I don't know how much traction Governor Hutchinson is going to have. We are a couple months away from Republicans standing on their first debate stage. We have yet to see the criteria for that. But I do think that it is yet another break that we're seeing between the Republican elected and former elected officials and the base of the Republican Party. A number of the primary voters, they are still with Donald Trump.
David, you've written about this a bit. There's a kind of fundamental dynamic here, and I want to see if you see this as well. It seems to me likely that any further legal action against Donald Trump will solidify some support for him in a Republican primary and also make him a worse general election candidate. And there's got to be a lot of people in Republican politics thinking about that right now.
Look, there are a lot of people in Republican politics who formerly supported Donald Trump, who support Donald Trump in theory, who are thinking about that right now. And I think the way you need to look at this is, for the time being, Trump is dominating the headlines and doesn't have much competition. And when you are the only guy out there, the only candidate out there that is fighting all of the interests and the other side that Republican voters are opposed to and want to see Republicans fight. I think episodes like this simply put into their head that Donald Trump is the only guy out there doing it. I think as we see some other candidates get into the race, then we'll have to reevaluate where the polling is and reevaluate where Republican primary voters are. There is a case to make that if you vote for Trump in the primary, you have a very iffy situation in the general election. And even if for some reason he wins the presidential election, and once you're the nominee, you can never rule that out. He only has 4 years in office. He's a lame duck president on day one. Wouldn't you like to vote for somebody with a better chance to win the general election and who could run for re-election and give you 8 years of conservative reforms? And I think Republican primary voters are willing to think this through and will think this through, but they have to be given a choice. And what have we seen, Chris, in the last couple of days? We've seen Trump dominate headlines so much that we're watching pictures of his motorcade go from his house to his plane, from his plane to his other house. And tomorrow it's going to be from his house to get mugshotted, and from mugshotting back to the plane, back to his house. And then it's up to any Republican who gets into this race to start fighting back and take it to him on offense. What have they been doing the last few days? All they have been doing is granting him cover, not actually pointing out that maybe you could vote for somebody who wasn't indicted.
Well, this is the thing, Symone. No one will take the shot. No one will, step up and, they've all basically just said they've said the same thing. This is outrageous. Asa Hutchinson has said, he should bow out. But aside from him, like everyone else, and particularly DeSantis, are towing the same line. It's very hard to differentiate yourself if you're doing that.
Everyone has defended Donald Trump here, even Jeb Bush. Again, and I don't think Jeb Bush is necessarily a fan of the former president. So, look, as someone who's worked a lot of campaigns, I fundamentally believe that you do, as a candidate in a very crowded race, have to differentiate yourself. And so if these candidates are not going to differentiate themselves, and to David's point, saying you can vote for someone who has not been indicted, they have to differentiate themselves on policy. The problem is we have yet to see that from these candidates either, right? From Nikki Haley, who is a declared candidate, to Pompeo, again, suggesting to get in, Mike Pence, down the line, you name it. No one has articulated how their policy would be fundamentally different from Donald Trump's.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, maybe with the exception of Ukraine, a little bit, Pence and Haley, Pence particularly on that, but that's really the only area we've seen any kind of distinction. David, to your point, I mean, I just want to take a step back because we're so in the 7 years into this reality warping vortex. I mean, if this weren't the case, right, if you were in another race and you said, your primary opponent is going to dominate the headlines and dominate media attention, and he will dominate said attention because he will have to go get indicted and arraigned and arrested because he is accused of a felony of falsifying business records to cover a hush money payment to a porn star that he had an affair with when his son was 3 months old. In other circumstances, it would be like, well, that's probably good for me, the other candidate in the race. It's a feature of the Republican base that it's not.
Well, look, I mean, there are many levels to this, and part of this goes to the history of how Republicans believe their candidates have been treated over the years.
Right.
Whether it's by law enforcement, whether it's by the media, and this is a psychology you're not going to unwind. Republican voters have a case to make in some instances. But I think the bottom line here, Chris, and this is what the last 72 hours has reminded me of. I talked in 2016 to so many Republican candidates who said, I can't get any airtime. All they want to do is ask me about Trump. And all voters saw was Trump. And right now, all they're seeing is Trump.
Symone, Sanders-Townsend,
but
David
Chris, can
Drucker.
I just say?
Yep, please, quickly.
We're out of time. Can I just say that is why I think the candidates should take the interviews, come on the air. I know you'd love to have them. I would too. Answer the tough questions and then force folks to talk about something else.
All right. Thank you. You can catch Symone this weekend on MSNBC or streaming on Peacock. That does it for All In. You can catch us every weeknight at 8 o'clock on MSNBC. Don't forget to like us on Facebook. That's facebook.com/allinwithchris.
Hey everyone, it's Tremaine Lee, MSNBC correspondent and host of the podcast Into America. A train derailment and chemical spill in East Palestine, Ohio, caused panic and anger among residents and triggered a big response from the EPA. But for people who live in so-called sacrifice zones, especially in Black communities, environmental issues like this are a way of life.
So when you live in a sacrifice zone, you're basically being poisoned every day. So it becomes an intergenerational cycle of poison and poor public health.
Listen now and follow wherever you get your podcasts.